Well, let's get to the speech, a whole load to dissect. Let's bring in our panel. Here in our studio, Rafael Bernal is a staff writer for the political newspaper The Hill. Also with us, John Sitilides is a geopolitical strategist with Trilogy Advisors. Simon Marks is the president and chief correspondent for Feature Story News. He joins us from their studio right here in Washington, D.C. And also with us on our set, Ivan Garcia Hidalgo is a Republican strategist and host of Batalla Politica on NTN24. Welcome to all of you to the show. John, let me start with you. Let's look at the foreign policy elements of the speech that the president made to Congress last night. And looking at that statement that he made, that we just played out, great nations don't fight endless wars. The president reiterating his desire there to bring foreign troops back home to the United States. How significant was that?
Highly significant, and I would say from a dual perspective, Anand. One, from a national security perspective, it's very consistent with everything that candidate Donald Trump said in 2015 and 2016, especially about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the NATO campaign against Libya. So I think it's very much consistent with what he has been saying, what he is trying to message out to his own staff, to the Congress, and to the international arena. There's not going to be the kind of precipitous pullout from Syria or from Afghanistan. I think a lot of this is messaging from the president and really giving directives to a bureaucracy that he feels has not given him optimal options for the kind of withdrawal that he sees as necessary. The other part of this, though, is I think domestic politics. Let's remember that the families across America that send their sons and daughters to war constitute a very tiny slice of the American population, maybe less than 1%. So here we are in Washington, D.C., sending our young men and women for combat around the world, but it's a very, very small minority of Americans that actually suffer the personal family losses. These are people who live in rural states, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's one of the reasons why he did so well in many of these states. These are the voters who were silent, but they came out in honor of the dead and those who risked their lives on behalf of America.
Right, just one point on that, John, and that is the president does face a political challenge on this, doesn't he? There was just a vote in the U.S. Senate where senators, and we have to remember that his own Republican Party has the majority in that chamber, but they are saying, no, the troops stay.
That's more a sense of the Senate resolution type, Anand. Ultimately, the Constitution and really the Supreme Court recognizes that the president has enormous authority when it comes to national security and foreign policy. What the Congress does have is the power of the purse. But I find it very difficult to imagine that a Republican Senate would vote to actually withhold funds from the execution or the implementation of the president's strategy. My guess is you'll have a coming together of the minds. A number of military strategists will come on board, top Republicans that the president trusts, and find some medium out of this as opposed to the extremes that the sides seem to have taken to date.
Right. Let me go to Simon Marks. Simon, how momentous a decision will this be, or the implementation of the decision for the U.S. to pull troops out of places like Afghanistan and Syria? I mean, are we going to see a smaller, I guess, U.S. military footprint in the world?
Well, momentous indeed. I think there's no question about that whatsoever. John is right. There is something authentic in what President Trump is saying. He genuinely believes it. I was talking over the New Year period with a very senior figure within his inner circle who said that he, the president, is absolutely driven and insists when he meets his generals that he wants to bring the troops back home. But I would take issue with this idea that somehow American military families are all backing Donald Trump. I mean, he has played an extraordinary game with them over the course of the last few weeks. Before Christmas, telling American military families not just that he was ordering a withdrawal of U.S. forces from Syria, but that they were all on their way home. The withdrawal had started, according to White House officials. And then, of course, we discovered that Jim Mattis, then the defense secretary, had thrown the brakes on. I think the real question here in terms of the future of America's military involvement in the region, in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan and elsewhere, is to what extent there are still any restraining influences left around the president who can slow him down. And that's a big open question.
Okay, John, very quickly, was the president playing a PR game here?
I don't believe so at all.
Okay, Ivan, let's look at some of the other parts of the speech. The president talked about the economy, low unemployment, modest growth rate in the country. He also talked about the crisis at the border. Of course, Democrats have been saying that there's no such crisis happening at the border. But what were your main takeaways from that speech?
Well, I thought it was a home run. And when we look at the polling, I think the vast majority of Americans believe that as well. The CBS poll came out, 97% of Republicans approved, 82% of independents approved, and we saw a dismal 30% from Democrats, but that's expected. Look, he hit every single point. He came out with a message of unity. He gave everybody on both sides something to listen to. He was very open about the fact that he wants to work with the Democrats, not pushing a Republican agenda or a Democrat agenda, but something for the American people, something along those words. And what he's trying to say is, look, there's an opportunity for both sides to get a win here. So let's work on getting that win. And that win is border security and, and DACA, TPS, some other things. But absolutely, I mean, he ran through a laundry list of every single accomplishment that he had, and it was fantastic. Things about jobs, things about the GDP growth, manufacturing jobs that the last administration said couldn't happen, couldn't be done unless somebody possessed a magic wand. He obviously found it, because he's been able to do that. Lowest unemployment in history for women, for blacks, for Hispanics. None of these things he gets credit for by the Democrats. Now Democrats are trying to take credit for all of that and giving it to the previous guy, which said couldn't happen, right?
Right, but I'm wondering,
so there's a lot of hypocrisy there.
Was he playing good cop and bad cop in the same speech there? Because on the one hand, saying, okay, I want unity, I'm going to reach out to the other side, and then in the next few minutes he slams the Democrats.
A little bit.
For the border issue, the wall issue, as well as the investigation that's being...
Well, I think the wall issue was, he should have. He called them out, in their face in front of everybody. They voted for this stuff in the past. The Secure Fence Act in 2006 of 13, they voted for walls, for barriers. We are paying for walls and barriers in the Middle East, that our military is putting up. So it's a lot of hypocrisy. What they're really doing, and I always accuse the Democrats of doing this, is playing with minorities, and in this case with Hispanics. They play this little game. At the end, they're not looking for any kind of solution except just pandering to a segment of the American population for votes. They want to do to Hispanics what they did to the African American community, is capture them and get them to vote 94% of the time and then forget about them. And that's reality.
Raphael, we have a little bit of the speech here when the president talks about that wall. Let's watch it.
It includes humanitarian assistance, more law enforcement, drug detection at our ports, closing loopholes that enable child smuggling, and plans for a new physical barrier or wall to secure the vast areas between our ports of entry. In the past, most of the people in this room voted for a wall, but the proper wall never got built. I will get it built.
So, Raphael, getting back to what Ivan just told us a moment ago, that the Democrats are playing politics with this. It's hypocrisy.
I mean, it is the Republican talking point. It is what the Republicans are trying to push. The Democrats, some must be playing politics because they don't all understand the issue entirely. But a lot of Democrats, and especially a lot of Democrats in leadership, which is important, have gotten to understand these issues more closely. Maybe for political convenience, we won't say why they've gotten to understand it better, but they understand that the barriers that exist are generally viewed as sufficient by the communities themselves, that the communities in Texas, for instance, really want to have a say in where the wall gets built. The example they always give you, for example, Henry Cuellar, who's hardly a progressive Democrat, he's very much a centrist, he says somebody in Washington took a crayon and drew a red line through my district, and that's where they want to build the wall. That's what I don't want. And it's a very compelling argument coming from the community perspective. And then, of course, there's the entire argument about the rampant lawlessness on the border, which, frankly, I mean, it's really hard to see evidence of that.
All right. Simon, what is your take on this? I mean, the president says it's a crisis. Is it a crisis?
Well, he's presented absolutely no evidence whatsoever to suggest that this is a crisis. The worldwide threat assessment compiled by his intelligence chiefs and published last week references the humanitarian issues on America's southern border on page 41 of a 42-page document. So no one around him, at least in the intelligence and defense sphere, believes that this is any kind of a crisis. And that, Anand, is his real problem. He spoke last night and cited the case of El Paso down in Texas as one community that he believed could absolutely benefit from a border wall. The mayor of El Paso is a Republican, and the Republican mayor of El Paso doesn't want a wall. So even within his own party, there is a hesitation among many to embrace what the president is proposing.
I'll get a quick response from you, Ivan, then I want to get on to something else. Go ahead.
Well, the wall is important. You know, you're going to have a lot of people that for some reason, they have this fantasy about walls being immoral or racist, which is absolutely absurd. There is a crisis when you see tens of thousands of people in caravans coming to invade your country. The only thing that stopped them last time were barriers. That's the only thing that detained them. If there were no barriers, no walls, they would have walked right through and overrun any Customs Border Patrol agent. So that's reality.
Yeah.
You know, people are going to spin it any single way they want. But reality is there is a caravan and there's another one behind it, and it's never going to stop unless we put a stop to it.
Okay, John, I want to get into the other big issue, and that is the Mueller investigation into whether there was collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia during the election, whether there was interference by Russia. The president referred to the Mueller investigation as ridiculous and partisan, and he compared it to the fact that this was taking place at a time when the economy was booming. Let's watch what he had to say.
An economic miracle is taking place in the United States, and the only thing that can stop it are foolish wars, politics, or ridiculous partisan investigations. If there is going to be peace and legislation, there cannot be war and investigation.
John, is the president worried about the Mueller investigation?
I don't think he's worried about the investigation itself. It's been almost 2 years now, and almost all indications are now that we're preparing for the possible release of the report in about a month or so, that there's no quote-unquote collusion. There's a lot of peripheral type of legal activity, but any investigator could have investigated any presidential campaign and found this kind of malfeasance. It's just the way federal laws operate. And if one goes further, one can say that President Trump has actually been tougher on Russia than any president, maybe the last 3 decades, in terms of providing lethal defensive weapons to the Ukrainians against the invasion of eastern Ukraine, sanctions against Russian oligarchs that are the protectorate for Vladimir Putin, putting a rapid deployment force on rotation in Poland and the Baltics. So on a whole host of fronts, and of course the economic sanctions on the Russian economy, and the U.S. exporting oil and natural gas around the world in a way that depresses pricing that is critical to Russia's economy. So from an objective perspective, I think President Trump has been especially tough on Russia, and the burden is on the investigators to demonstrate evidence. And at least from the public domain, I haven't seen anything that looks like collusion at all. So I don't know how this is going to be framed in a month or so.
But John, you're making the legal argument when this is about politics, isn't it?
But the politics will dominate this no matter what, Anand. And Adam Schiff and others in the Democratic-led House, Gerald Nadler, have made very clear they're going to investigate the Trump Foundation, the Trump children's taxes and the like. But we forgot the central issue. The accusation was that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin colluded to allow Donald Trump to win the presidency of the United States. When you make a charge like that, you need to prove it. And if you can't prove it, it's over. And there's no proof, and my guess is because nothing ever happened.
Yeah, the only thing they're looking for right now is they're on a mission to find anything, absolutely anything to try and get this guy. And it's all about the election. They lost the election. They're absolutely sour. And their response to that election loss has been to try and weaken, destroy, and eventually impeach this president. That's the only thing they've done. We look at the 16 lawyers that are surrounding Mueller. 13 have donated to the DNC or to Hillary Clinton. These are not impartial people. You look at everything in the direction that they're going. They grabbed Michael Cohen. Okay, great. He didn't pay some taxes, or he didn't do something with some, cab licenses. Everything that they've grabbed Cohen or or Manafort or even Roger Stone have nothing to do with Donald Trump.
Okay.
What they're trying to do is they're just trying to grab anybody, squeeze them, and see if they can flip them and say, yeah, I'll let you go,
right.
but you got to make up a story about Donald Trump, and that's really what it is. If there was anything about collusion, we would have heard about it. Like John said, it's been 2 years, and we have not even one single thing.
All right.
And that's what it's about.
Simon, I know you want to comment on this, but I also have another question for you, but go ahead.
Well, I just feel like I'm living in a parallel universe. Everything regarding this investigation is about Donald Trump. The arrest of Roger Stone, which yielded voluminous amounts, terabytes of data as a result of that dawn raid on his residence and his office in New York, is all about the association between the Trump campaign, Roger Stone, Julian Assange of WikiLeaks, and the Kremlin. And I don't believe for 1 second that we're going to see a Mueller report within the next month. It has been 16 months since the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, described Robert Mueller as wrapping up. He wasn't then, and he isn't now.
Okay, Simon, I want to get back to the speech. You know, we have a president right now who has very low approval ratings, but we looked at 2 polls. In fact, Ivan mentioned one of them, instant polls that were taken right after the speech, which showed that more than 3/4 of those surveyed approved of the president's speech. So clearly he did something right in the speech, didn't he?
Look, I don't think at the end of the day he has to worry particularly about the disapproval ratings or the fact that last week 56% of the American electorate told pollsters they definitely would not support Donald Trump in the next presidential election. He's got to worry about his base, and that's why, for all the laughable talk last night about unity, completely undone by the fact that over lunch with the television news anchors, he used a profanity to describe Charles Schumer, the Democrats' leader in the Senate, that has no place on a family television program. In the State of the Union address, he accused one Democrat, the beleaguered governor of Virginia, of proposing to execute babies. I mean, that was all about, together with the abortion section of the piece, of the speech, trying to energize his base. If he can just keep them on side and get them out in November 2020, if he's the Republican Party's presidential nominee, then he can bring it home for a second term.
Okay, Rafael, I want to get to one other big issue that was discussed in the speech, and that is a foreign policy issue, the Korean nuclear issue. This is what the president said. Let's watch it.
If I had not been elected President of the United States, we would right now, in my opinion, be in a major war with North Korea. Much work remains to be done, but my relationship with Kim Jong-un is a good one. Chairman Kim and I will meet again on February 27th and 28th in Vietnam.
So the president is taking a lot on this meeting with Kim Jong-un. He's taking a lot on this nuclear issue as well. Was it a bit of hyperbole to say that the United States would be at war now with the DPRK?
Well, he has that independent clause, in my opinion, to defend him, to say that it wasn't that much hyperbole, but really it was. I mean, you can't, this idea of an alternate history is interesting, and especially for a president who started his relationship with the North Koreans on the verge of war. He was very aggressive, and yeah, let's give him the benefit of the doubt that that aggressiveness led to an openness, but there has been also a lot of criticism about how he's dealt with North Korea and sort of the legitimacy that he's given a regime that the democratic world considers to be essentially a rogue regime.
John, how much of a gamble is this for the president? I mean, he held that meeting with Kim Jong-un, the first summit they had in Singapore. What did he get out of that?
Well, first of all, we have a measure of progress in terms of dialogue that simply hasn't existed over 2.5 decades of 3 failed administrations in trying to resolve this issue. So Presidents Clinton, Bush 43, and Obama all failed to stop the nuclearization program. Now, is this going to work? We have no idea. Is it highly disruptive and unorthodox? Yes. Well, welcome to Trump world, right? This is what he's doing across the international arena. But we have the possibility here, especially working closely with potentially China, South Korea, and Japan, to put together a framework that provides the kind of security assurances that Kim Jong-un needs to halt and maybe start to pull back even if they don't get to complete denuclearization, I think we're at a better place now than when President Obama, on the way to the Trump inaugural, told President Trump, this is going to be your #1 national security issue, and it seems to be much better managed today than I think most people would have predicted.
Ivan, isn't this affording great credibility, photo ops really, for Kim Jong-un to be seen with the United States president? Because we look at the core issue that they're discussing here, dismantling the DPRK's nuclear arsenal. There's been no progress, has there?
Well, it's a process, right? These guys were throwing missiles over Japan just a few months ago, before President Trump took the positions that he took. You know, he put them on the table and he said, listen, you know, this is what's going to happen. You continue to play games like this and we're going to wipe you out. There's no, it's not going to be a conventional situation and we're going to end this quickly. Unlike, like John said, you know, the previous administrations all failed. So it was time to act, time to do something, and it's worked. You know, they're not launching missiles today. There is no aggression. There is, you know, they're talking to their neighbors in the South. You know, there's a conversation, and whenever dialogue is happening, that's a positive thing. So you have to say, regardless of dismantling and timeframes, as long as there is dialogue and things are going in the right direction, I think you got to check one off for the president.
Okay, Simon, talking about dialogue, the trade dispute with China goes on. There have been talks. Recently, there was talks, very high-level talks here in Washington. This is a big issue for the president. This is what he said at the State of the Union speech.
We recently imposed tariffs on $250 billion of Chinese goods, and now our Treasury is receiving billions and billions of dollars. But I don't blame China for taking advantage of us. I blame our leaders and representatives for allowing this travesty to happen. I have great respect for President Xi, and we are now working on a new trade deal with China.
Looking at this dispute, Simon, between President Trump and China, how big a deal is this for the American people? Does the president think he's on the winning side here?
Well, it's a very big deal for the American people, and it's a very big deal in parts of the country that backed Donald Trump for the presidency. And he knows that his message to those parts of the country, stay the course, be patient, we'll get through this and we'll win it, has at the end of the day to deliver something tangible for him. I thought it was very interesting in the speech last night that he was very restrained on that issue of the China trade war and attempts to resolve it. It almost felt as though some of his advisors had reined him in and had said, look, this is at a very delicate point at the moment. Do not say very much about it. He articulated cadences there that we've heard many times from President Trump in rallies and in press conferences, but I think he was treading a very careful line there in order not to mess anything up that continues to be negotiated behind the scenes.
Okay, John?
Well, I think President Trump wants a deal. And so we're looking now at the next 6 to 7 weeks. And there was a very high-level Chinese delegation in the Oval Office that announced publicly that the Chinese government will be purchasing massive quantities of American food products, agricultural products. That's a good start. But I think what the Trump administration is looking for is structural reforms in China. But at this very delicate time, it's moving the ball forward little by little, but he's not going to be saying anything at the State of the Union speech that's going to completely disrupt and upend what is hopefully going to be a monumental deal for the U.S. and China together in the weeks ahead.
Rafael, go ahead.
Well, overall, what did surprise me about this speech in the end was what he didn't mention, not so much what he did mention. He didn't mention Puerto Rico a single time. He didn't mention DACA a single time, and he didn't mention the shutdown a single time. That was sort of amazing because, well, first of all, I was waiting to write the story on what he did say about those three things. But second of all, because the part that didn't surprise anyone is Democrats hated it, Republicans loved it. We knew that was going to happen.
And we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.